and thank you all for joining us this morning. For those of you who are new to Foreign Policy Research Institute events, I am the chair of the program and a trustee of FPRI. I'd like to welcome each and every one of you. For those of you who are new, just to give you a run of show, we will have a noted panelist who will be discussing our subject with me, and then we will ask him to answer the questions that you in the audience might have. As we proceed with this event, if you have questions, you will notice at the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A icon. If you have questions, please enter them there. If you put them in the chat box, they might get overlooked. We will try to get to all of your questions as quickly as we can. This is just a quick plug for the Africa program before we get started. We are one of the smaller and newer programs of FPRI, and while these events that we schedule are free to you to participate, they're not free to us, and so your support for the program would be greatly appreciated. And with that, we'll get right into it. The subject today is the Russian Orthodox Church and its activities in Africa. After the invasion of Ukraine, a dispute between the Orthodox churches in Moscow and Ukraine caused the break. And since the Greek Orthodox Church sided with Ukraine, this seems to have irked Moscow, who then, in what seems to be retaliation against the Greek Church, opened two dioceses of the Russian Orthodox Church in Africa, one in the north and one in South Africa. We're going to be talking about that today. Our panelist is a noted scholar of Russia and Africa and author of a book recently published last year on Russia in Africa. I highly recommend this book. And as I said, our panelist today is Dr. Sam Ramani, a noted scholar who is currently working on issues of Russian activity in Africa and how that impacts the continent, as well as policies of other countries in Africa. He will speak to us for a few minutes on this subject, and then we'll get to the questions. I would like to, you've seen Dr. Ramani's bio on our site, and so I won't go into that. I'll let him tell you what he has to say about the subject. Dr. Ramani, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Charlie. It's great to be here. Yeah, I would say that the current Russian Orthodox Church's activity in Africa has certainly intensified since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, in tandem with Russia's pursuit of non-Western partnerships and the sharpening of the alienation between Russia and the West. But I would actually time the start of it to the events that happened in 2019, when we really first saw the split within Orthodoxy, when Patriarch Theodore II of Alexandria recognized the independent Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and then the Russian Orthodox Synod basically broke off all communion and connections to it in later that year. And then flash forward to 2021, you see the creation of the African Exarchate, which are the dioceses of the Russian Orthodox Church in various African countries, and the infrastructure that we saw them use since the start of the current war invasion of Ukraine was already firmly established by the time Putin announced the start of a special military operation in February 24th, 2022. So this is something that's been in development for about 5 years and exacerbated firmly by the ongoing war in Ukraine, in particular Patriarch Bartholomew and other Alexandria Orthodox alignments, basically saying that Patriarch Kirill's promotion of Russian ultranationalism and militarism is completely antithetical to the ideas and the values of the church. It also reflects the diminution of the Russian Orthodox Church's soft power, especially in its traditional domain in Eastern Europe and the post-Soviet space. The Serbian Orthodox Church and some factions of the Georgian Orthodox Church, which are tied to the Georgian Dream Party and Benzina Ivanishvili, seem to be some of the only public defenders of the current Russian Orthodox Church under Patriarch Kirill. And defenses are sometimes coming from sources that are unlikely and unrelated, like Viktor Orban and Hungary, putting their thumbs down basically on the potential sanctions from the EU on the Orthodox Church, and also calling for the retention of their property inside Hungary and making that immune from sanctions also. So this is a reflection of the collapse of relations between the various Orthodox branches since 2019, and also the Russian Orthodox Church's growing isolation within its particular sphere of influence. And it's pretty telling also that in 2019, Russia hosted the first Africa summit in Sochi, and these all events seem to coincide, right? The Russian resurgence in Africa and the increased ambitions of the church, which furthermore strengthens the thesis that the church is an instrument of the Russian state, Russian soft power, and Russian diplomacy. In terms of where we are in the context of the Russian Orthodox Church's presence in Africa, there's a couple of points that I wanted to make a strong emphasis on. In terms of geography, we're seeing them carrying out activities not just in areas where Russia has got a stronghold. Yes, of course, Central African Republic, where the Russians have got Wagner Group mercenaries and bodyguards for the president, was one of the first countries where the Orthodox Church received official registration after 2021. But they're also building ties in other countries where Russia's economic links and post-Soviet diplomatic links are relatively thin, like Tanzania or Zambia. Like Zambia, for example, condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine and objected strongly to Prigozhin's recruitment of a foreign fighter who died on the Ukrainian battlefields. So Russia is using its Orthodox Church not just to strengthen its relationship with existing clients or the form of state capture, but also to broaden its appeal in Africa. It's a little bit different, for example, than some of the Russian culture and Russian language adoptions, like CAR adopting Russian language as their other official language aside from French. It's that those seem to be just force multipliers in areas where Russia already has strength. The Orthodox Church is actually being used as a tool of diplomacy and to break into new markets and to break into new countries. That's just one point I want to make at the start. The second thing is that the Russian Orthodox Church is an extension of Russia's promotion of conservative values on the African continent. Basically, one of Russia's primary selling points, which is actually made by Patriarch Kirill in the 2023 St. Petersburg Economic Forum, when he said, "We are united by an adherence to traditional values, conservative view of human nature, rejection of the ideology of permissiveness and overconsumption." And Putin basically repeated this comment at the same summit, is something that the Russians are trying to show, that they're basically more aligned and attuned to the values of the African public than what the West is. And this is a reflection of a broader diplomatic effort to promote conservatism that coincided with the breakdown of Russia-West relations over the annexation of Crimea. During the final 2 years of the Obama administration, there were two events that the United States had, and two decisions the United States made that Russia was able to capitalize on. The first was the United States taking a firm stance on the Nigerian government's human rights indiscretions and the Nigerian government's handling of the Chibok girls crisis. That led to the cessation of Apache jet fighters and the Nigerians turning to Russian MiGs. But Russia basically used that as a sign that it is a partner that's not willing to interfere in the values or try to change the values of other states, but rather try to complement and enrich those values. Russian Orthodox Church operatives and Russian political operatives, even at that time, were trying to spread the notion that the real reason why Nigeria was facing problems purchasing American fighter jets was not because of the human rights abuses, but because Nigeria was not taking the American position of tolerance towards LGBT rights. And when I interviewed some Nigerian experts and Nigerian civil society figures who were somewhat skeptical of the West, some of those narratives came up when I was writing my book. Another area where the Russians did manage to capitalize on was Uganda's capital punishment and repression of the LGBT community. And that became a major controversy along with Museveni's election fraud between Uganda and the United States. And that did not just lead to Russian state companies like RT Global entering the oil sector, but also led to an expansion of a conservative values-based outreach between Moscow and Kampala that extended elsewhere. So that's why it's not surprising that the first 7 countries to achieve registration for the Orthodox Church, one was Nigeria, one was Uganda. So this reflects a broader pursuit of an alignment of values and the promotion of Russian conservatism across the globe. And this is related to that. A third thing that's quite interesting is that Russia is capitalizing on what basically the double standards many African countries feel very strongly about. Many African countries are frustrated, for example, that so much attention and so much aid is given to the war in Ukraine, and so little attention is being paid to the war in Sudan, or in crises in the Sahel, or crises in Central Africa. So that perceived Western selective engagement or disengagement from Africa, or perceptions of Western neocolonialism, is something that the Russian Orthodox Church is keen to exploit. And how does the Russian Orthodox Church do that? By promoting information campaigns and by also providing humanitarian aid. The information campaigns that were actually led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, even though Prigozhin is about as far as you can get from somebody who's pious or religious or particularly moralistic. And Leonid Gorbachev, who was one of the key actors in the Russian Orthodox Church in Africa, was a close Prigozhin ally. Since Prigozhin's death, we've been seeing other actors getting involved in this. One, I think, is of great importance is the oligarch Konstantin Malafiev, who some of you might know is the first Russian oligarch to see his assets frozen and redirected towards Ukraine by the U.S. Treasury Department. He is hiring influencers and recruiters, people like Alexander Dugin, holdovers from the past with conservative views like Sergei Glaziev, are amongst the kinds of officials and actors who are promoting Russian influence in Africa in this kind of conservative way. Also, the Russian Orthodox Church is providing significant humanitarian aid to African countries. That is basically something that creates good PR and creates soft power for them. So basically, when Morocco had an earthquake, they gave winter clothes to people. They're building orphanages. They're providing food aid and food supply to counter some of the narratives about Russia's weaponization of food during the Black Sea grain deal crisis and the Ukrainian crisis. This is something that is an enduring feature of this. The broader thing is not just to win over Russian publics, but as there's a USIP report that said this quite articulately, the two Russian targets are authoritarian elites and public opinion. So providing aid and engaging more with countries that the West is ignoring also strengthens autocracies in those countries too. So just a couple of takeaways. This is not something that's new to the Ukrainian post-Ukraine war situation. This is something that's been in movement for about 5 years. The Russian resurgence in Africa and the Russian Orthodox Church's activity in Africa are inextricably linked in terms of timing and methods. And the Russian Orthodox Church's primary goals are to promote conservatism and create a soft power base, basically try to whitewash some of Russia's most egregious conduct on the continent and internationally, and to help Russia break into new frontiers and to countries where they may not be able to have big trade deals or send Africa Corps or Wagner mercenaries too, but they can still get a foothold.
Thank you. That's a lot to digest, but it leads to a point that I have as I looked at this issue, and I'm not an expert on religion by any means, but I do know that the percentage of Africa's Christians who are Orthodox is very small, right, in real terms. And so the question that immediately came to my mind is the Russian Orthodox Church presence in Africa based on religion, or is it based primarily on something else entirely? I mean, I think you sort of hit at that, is that it appears that the Russian Orthodox Church, the presence there, as a friend of mine in South Africa that we were emailing back and forth on said that they're basically not there to convert or even so much to tend to the religious needs of the Orthodox population on the continent, but as an influence operation. And you sort of alluded to that. As we, or as the policymakers in the U.S. and other countries look at Africa, how should they then look at the Russian Orthodox Church presence?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that you're absolutely right. This has got very little to do, in my view, with religion. And there's not like there's going to be a whole lot of a wave of converts to the Russian Orthodox Church, even there. And it's interesting that some of the main proponents of Russian Orthodoxy in Africa are not necessarily, religious figures. For example, they send 100 priests to Kenya, which is a very small number, and small delegations of clergy. A lot of the people who are involved are some of the same spin doctors and political operatives who are affiliated with people like Prigozhin or Malafiev or Dugin or many of these other ultranationalist intellectuals and disinformation purveyors. And they're the ones who actually are most involved in the Orthodox Church and activities. And it's not new for the Russians to use the Orthodox Church to as a tool of diplomacy in areas where there's obviously very little chance for it to take root. Another example is Cuba, right? Basically, there was a Russian Orthodox Church that was built in Cuba from 2004 to 2008. It was a very small community. But as the Russian-Cuban relationship got closer because of the decline of Russian-American relations and Russia's growing presence in Latin America and ties with countries like Venezuela and Ecuador and some others, it became something that was a lot more significant. There was a meeting between Patriarch Kirill and Pope Francis there. There was a lot of diplomacy that was aimed at basically kind of supporting and shoring up the Castro regime, meeting with Raul Castro, all these type of things, right? And Cuba had taken Russia's stance on the Ukraine war and the Syrian war at the same time. So that's an early example of how Russia basically was using the Orthodox Church as a tool of diplomacy in a place where it was not really expecting to have a chance to gain a whole lot of converts, but was using it as kind of a anti-American shot or for authoritarian solidarity. And that early experience where H.R. Kirill was quite successful in Cuba is something that the current operatives are using now inside Africa. When you look at the messaging that was even coming from Leonid Gorbachev, it was not really very much about religious ideas. It wasn't really very much about anything that's ecumenical by any means. It was about promoting how Ukraine is Satanist. Ukraine is a Nazi country that is kind of undermining the Slavic race and undermining the Russian language and just cracking down on Russians. So it was very much aimed at reinforcing the Russian propaganda about denazification and selling that to audiences inside Africa, and that was implicitly also linked to the broader idea that the West is on the side of Nazism and fascism. We're on the side of liberation and standing against fascism, and bizarrely enough, standing against racism and colonialism. That's kind of what that's also tied to. And is also his messaging was very, very closely linked to defending the conduct of the Russian Orthodox, was the Russian Wagner mercenaries in Mali and Central African Republic, talking about how much popular support they were getting, talking about how effective they were in combating terrorism and in promoting state stability. So it's pretty clear that even from the messaging of the Russian Orthodox Church's main influencers and the nature of the influencers involved, that this is much more about politics and propaganda and very little about religion. And this is the same playbook that they basically have used elsewhere in the world at earlier stages. And Cuba was a particularly interesting example of that.
Right. So those who look at the Russian Orthodox Church in Africa through the lens of religious freedom, who it could very well be driving the policy bus. What would your advice be to policymakers looking at crafting a policy towards Africa that takes into account Russian Orthodox Church activities? How would you craft a policy to deal with that didn't then run afoul of freedom of religion issues?
Yeah, that is a really interesting question. I think the first thing that needs to be done is greater engagement in Africa. This is, as I said earlier, this is a symptom of Western disengagement, the West seemingly ignoring humanitarian crises in various countries and not paying enough attention to it. So if the West just simply was trying to engage more in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo or which is undergoing so much conflict and instability and M23 and all the crises there, or it's the Central African Republic, or some of the crises in the Horn of Africa, more assertiveness in the Sudan issue. A lot of the Russian Orthodox Church's selling points and propaganda would diminish, and humanitarian aid is and keeping that at a high level, I think, is very important to neutralizing this because that's their main tool that they have at their disposal. I think another thing that would also be important to do would be to really launch some kind of a parallel information campaign. It doesn't seem as if Western efforts to combat Russian disinformation in Africa are really focused on the narratives of the Russian Orthodox Church or on the very actors who are involved in the Russian Orthodox Church. It's pretty tellingly, for example, that Maria Lvova-Belova, for example, who's the main architect of the abduction of Ukrainian children, who's on an ICC warrant, is one of the key figures who was entrusted with the expansion of the Russian Orthodox Church's activity abroad, including in the African continent. And so just basically kind of laying out who is involved in this and trying to really show that these people are extremely far away from any kind of religious beliefs and values, and also basically trying to uh, deal with the issue of Western disengagement. I think would be something that's quite important. Another thing that would probably be noted would be trying to look for and trying to examine some of the financial links that are kind of promoting and propping up the Russian Orthodox Church, and seeing where and which loopholes in the sanctions regime the Russians are using to pursue this. I mean, obviously, Malafiev is very heavily sanctioned. There's Okulov, who's another official who was linked to Malafiev in the U.S. Treasury Department. His lawyers and his staff have denied this. They're obviously, he's a Moldovan influencer. He's involved in promoting conservative values in the Sahel through IASD and in other Francophone countries. Some of those key figures have already been sanctioned. Some of Dugin's network, Prognosis network, Belova have all been hit. But there's also funding that's coming through other sources. For example, who's funding the St. Petersburg Theological Academy, which is basically the place where Russian Orthodox Church next generation of priests come from, who are promoting this kind of propaganda. That's being funded by Rosatom. That's being funded by the nuclear energy company. And Rosatom is, in spite of its occupation of the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, in spite of the fact that it is closely linked as a source of funding for the Russian war effort, and its close ties to a wide variety of Russian state and sanctioned entities, is obviously not on the sanctions list. Maybe there'll be a change to that with the U.S. restricting the imports of some Russian uranium coming forward. There's a concern about uranium market disruption. But the point is, we also need to be looking at the money flows and the financial side, because Russia in the Orthodox Church is all, just like the way it is in the importation of dual-use goods for its military, is taking advantage of some of the loopholes and some of the weaknesses in the sanctions enforcement regime to promote its activities. So we should be really treating the Russian Orthodox Church not as an issue that's a religious organization purely, or this being an issue of religious freedom. We should really be treating it as an agent of influence of the Kremlin, a political tool, and not too different from the way we've looked at the Wagner Group, or we've looked at other institutions, or RT, or any other institutions of Russian influence that we've taken a much harder stance on.
Right. One of in doing what you just suggested is going to require a well-staffed diplomatic establishment on the ground, not just American, but our allies as well, and a lot of coordination among the various Western allies to see that we're all sort of not necessarily singing the same song, but that we're not singing conflicting. People aren't getting conflicting messages. What is your prognosis of the chances of that happening in the short term, of fully staffed embassies, of coordinated messaging on the part of the U.S. and its allies in Africa?
That is something that's going to probably take quite a while for it to be achieved. That's just one thing that's there. I agree with you. I mean, the fact is, the Russian Orthodox Church has been being used as a political tool by Putin really since Patriarch Kirill's ascension to power in 2009, and in fact, probably even earlier than that, when it was big, when some of its this political element of it was also backing the Serbian Orthodox Church and the Serbian government's atrocities during the Balkan Wars. Some of the key missions with anti-Western countries were established in the mid-2000s. The thing is, the West is approaching the politicization of the Russian Orthodox Church and its movement to be basically far too late. It was as early as 2012, for example, Patriarch Kirill was talking about how Vladimir Putin's victory was some kind of a divine providence. It was like some kind of a gift from God. He was promoting opposition to both the Euromaidan revolution and the also in Ukraine, as well as the Arab Spring protests and other pro-democracy movements. He got a little bit of a pass in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea because he was a bit uncertain that endorsing that outright would sharpen the divide between the Russian and Ukrainian Orthodox churches. But ultimately, Patriarch Kirill realized that his agency was very limited, and he had to toe the Putin line, and he did. So the problem is that we've just been so far behind the eight ball. It's going to take many years to catch up, and that catch up may not have necessarily been something that's that could have been avoidable. That's just one point I want to make. But yes, definitely there needs to be more staffing of embassies, more paying attention to the information environment and being more proactive in terms of it and in terms of countering some of the most egregious propaganda, as well as also acknowledging the fact that the Russian Orthodox Church does have a long history in Africa, even though it's got very few adherents. It was started in the 19th century, and the Russians tend to promote that at various services. Like, for example, the Orthodox Christian service that began in Zimbabwe earlier this year, and when the 1,000 people were baptized in Malawi earlier this year. That history of the Russian Orthodox Church, how it's somehow part of the tradition of African religiosity, is something that the Russians promote quite strongly. And that's also very similar to how the Russians used to try to frame themselves as being a part of the broader collective Islamic world for many, many years, from attending the OIC summits and also using the Muslim regions like Chechnya, Ingushetia, and Tatarstan to build partnerships with Muslim communities of a variety of sectors. Ingushetia reaching out to the Muslim Brotherhood, Chechnya reaching out to some of the more secular forms of Islamism via the Grozny Conference and engaging with the UAE and more secular based forms or versions of Islam. The Russian Orthodox Church is relying on these historical legacies to kind of give itself legitimacy, and also it's copying a lot of the playbooks that were successful for Russia's outreaches to the Muslim world and Russia's use of Muslim minority regions. So when we're trying to understand how to deal with the policy, we should also be looking at some of the precedents that were set from the Russian soft power building efforts in the Middle East, which have been successful, and also where we were behind the 8 ball on. And finally, I think another way, and I think that would probably resonate very well with the incoming administration, with the Republican Party, would be to really call out, or to be more assertive about calling out cases where there's religiously motivated violence in Africa, where Christian churches are under attack. For example, RT back in May of 2023 did an in-depth show, an expose about Christianity under attack in Africa. And that was then those narratives and those messages were reiterated by the Russian Orthodox Church in some of its political operations, and that resonated, that struck a chord. So talking about some of those issues in a more firm way and paying more attention to that might also help deal with the problem too. But I think that the biggest thing is that we've been behind the 8 ball. Now it's time to take this threat seriously, but it may take a while before we're actually able to do anything meaningful to contain it.
Great. I have one more question I'd like to ask before we go to the questions from our audience. What's your take on what the Orthodox Church in Alexandria might do in response to Russia's increased presence, the Russian Orthodox Church's increased public presence on the continent?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think that so far the Russian Orthodox Church in Alexandria has been trying to present itself as some kind of a moderate counterweight that is more in line with the mainstream values of the people of Africa. So they're taking advantage of some of the more incendiary comments that are coming from Patriarch Kirill in support of the war and kind of flipping it around. I mean, I think that one example was that back in August, there was a senior cleric of the Russian Orthodox Church that was basically trying to promote and present the case that nuclear weapons could actually be used in a moral fashion, and that was something that's highly acceptable. And that was directly a product of Russian political discourse at that time. When you go to the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, where Sergei Karganov, the hawkish nuclear advisor who believes that the dropping a nuke on Ukraine or on a NATO country would basically coerce the West into capitulation, was talking about how we may need to use nuclear weapons to kind of end Western decadence and end the emergence of new Sodoms and Gomorrahs all across the Western world. So some of those extreme commentaries, some of those extreme endorsements of the most dangerous elements of Russian state policy and the most militaristic elements of Russian state policy since 2022 are being countered by the church in Alexandria on the ground and through their parallel messaging and sermons. So that's one way in which I'm seeing it happen. I'm seeing that happen more probably effectively in the post-Soviet space, maybe less in the or in other regions and less in Africa. But that's certainly something that I'm trying to notice. Basically, they're trying to create this synaxis of pedarchy, which is something that the Special Council of the Eastern Patriarchates, which is aimed at condemning the Russian Orthodox Church's actions and kind of cracking down on autocephaly and isolating some of the Russian Orthodox Church priests like Andrei Novikov and Georgy Maximov, basically stripping them, deeming them to be like kind of completely alienated from the core beliefs of the church. That's how they're doing it. So I think that they're more involved in terms of isolating individuals, isolating the church writ large, and promoting some counter narratives by capitalizing on some of the most extreme elements. But on the flip side, the Russian Orthodox Church is pushing the narrative that Western interference is creating, and there's some kind of a global conspiracy, is trying to undermine and divide and split the Orthodox Church. And that began in 2018 when the Ukrainian Orthodox Church began to start separating from the Russian Orthodox Church. They already started promoting these sorts of narratives. And sometimes the Russian Orthodox Church is trying to present itself as an ally of the Vatican and an ally of some Catholic groups against this kind of assault on the unity of its religion to try to win over African Catholics. So there is some things that the Alexandria Church is doing and can do in terms of isolating, but if they go too far in that direction, there are also anti-Western conspiracies that the Russian Orthodox Church is very adept at spreading that will basically play into the anti-colonial narratives that they're also spreading and kind of rally and rally people together. Another thing that we should also watch for is how the Russian Orthodox Church is dealing with the rising tide of food insecurity and Islamic extremism in West Africa. Because basically, the Russian Orthodox Church's mantra, well, one of the preachers said, like, Putin gives Africans free reign and soldiers to fight Islamists. And now the church is going to kind of promote and strengthen that. So I think that if the one area where I'm not seeing much activity from the Alexandria Church, which might be interesting for them to look into, is West Africa, because that's a major front of their expansion.
Right. Okay, well, thank you. And now let's go to our audience. We have a number of questions. I'll start. The first one here is, would you mind telling me what's your point of view about the ramifications of the geopolitics of religion in Africa?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, so many different things you could probably talk about with that. I would say that, yeah, religion has become, unfortunately, to some extent, a tool of soft power, right? I'm really kind of adhering to the idea that there is religious soft power, so it's inextricably linked to the broader contestation at a geopolitical level. And so that's just one point I wanted to make. And yeah, well, we're seeing it basically also in the versions of Islam that are basically being promoted from the Iranians, for example, trying to engage with residual Shiite groups and using Hezbollah to try to establish networks with some Shiites in countries like Nigeria and other parts of West Africa. I mean, that's another dimension of it. We're seeing when the Gulf crisis was in full swing, and we were seeing very different versions of Islam being promoted by the three main Gulf monarchies. Qatar kind of promoting the Muslim Brotherhood and more grassroots forms of Islamism, the United Arab Emirates promoting a more secular interpretation of Islam, and Saudi Arabia trying, under Mohammed bin Salman, trying to create this awkward balance of arch conservatism and Wahhabism with some anti-Muslim Brotherhood and progressive tendencies. We started seeing each of those three Gulf monarchies reaching out to various different African clients with their own vision, trying to contain them. Countries like Mauritania, countries like Somalia became battlegrounds in the broader conflict between the anti-Qatar and Qatar blocs. So this is nothing new. This is not necessarily confined just to Christianity. That's the point I wanted to make. Religious soft power is certainly something that we are watching in the Islamic world also, and it's played into the regional rivalries there, and it's something we should keep an eye on. Another example of where religion and politics have also fused together has been Turkey's involvement in Africa. In particular, some of Turkey's crackdown on Gulenism and the extradition of key figures. I mean, of the 80 alleged Gulenists who were basically extradited during the first 4 years after the 2016 coup attempt. Many of them came from various African countries. And the Gulen movement had operations led by Metin Erbakan from the mid-1990s. So basically 20 years of growth and expansion, including schools, including infrastructure, was ultimately taken down. So we're seeing, religion basically be used as and weaponized for authoritarian repression. We're seeing it being used in geopolitical rivalries in the Islamic context. And now we're seeing it with the emergence of Russian influence happening in the context of Christianity also. So when trying to devise and trying to think of policy, we should be looking at the fact that Russia's outreaches to the Islamic world and the Christian world are similar, but also some of the trends we're seeing amongst in Islamism are very similar to the trends we're seeing in Christianity.
Okay. Here's a question from one of our audience. You mentioned Gorbachev, and the question is: are those references to Riza Gorbachev? Could you please clarify? Do you recall that?
Oh yeah. So Leonid Gorbachev, I'm not referring to. He just happens to have a very interesting name. He is about as far away from Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev as you can imagine. He is not a liberal. He's not somebody who wants to make reforms or engage with the West. He is a strong supporter of Russia's promotion of Ukrainian Nazism and propaganda about that. About strong support of the Wagner Group. He was on Prigozhin's payroll. He is basically a political operative who was somewhat defanged by the death of Prigozhin because he was forced into early retirement. So the presumption is that he's fallen out of favor with the Russian state. So that's kind of who he is and who he's involved in. He was, I would say that basically he was acting as a surrogate for Prigozhin in areas where the Wagner Group already had forces and where France was extremely unpopular. And that was kind of how he managed to get his rise to power. So I think that's who that is. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Next question here. Is the Greek Orthodox Church assimilated? And I'm assuming that what the writer means is associated to the West in Africa. Is there a counter narrative on behalf of the Greek Orthodox Church, especially given that Greece is not a former colonial power, therefore rendering the Russian narrative invalid? I mean, you talked about that, but how would you address that question?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I would say that, yeah, obviously, Greece is engaging quite substantially with Africa, and in some ways, we're seeing that basically with the EU's Global Gateway Initiative in terms of free trade. We're seeing them paying attention in terms of cultural exchanges also, and there's also the sub-Saharan African migrants who have moved to Greece. Lots of things that have happened that led to the Greek culture, Greek diplomacy strengthening. Some of it may also be, I think a lot of it was tied to the broader rivalry and the broader resurgence of influence of Turkey in Africa under Erdogan. But there is, yeah, I mean, obviously the Greek Orthodox Church can present itself as an anti-colonial force as well. But if the Alexandria Church is seen as part or parcel to this global isolation campaign against Russia, it will get tied to the West. And that's what the Russian Orthodox Church tends to do. And also, they're tying increasingly the Alexandria Church to Ukraine, right? That's something that they're also tying it to, like basically talking about Zelensky as a force of evil, and how the other variant of the church is backing Ukraine's resistance, and trying to tap into skeptical sentiments of the West, of African countries towards Ukraine, in part because of things like Zelensky's alignment with Israel after the start of the Gaza war, trying to capitalize on youths who may be very enraged by Israeli conduct in Gaza, but may not know very little about the Ukraine war, trying to turn them against Ukraine. So the big problem is that even though Greece is definitely making some interesting outreaches and maybe some constructive outreaches to Africa, and also there is the lack of colonial history that we're noticing, they're being tied in and lumped in with the West too strongly, and also lumped in increasingly with Ukraine. So I think that one of the other things that we haven't talked about yet has been the strategic deficit and the strategic challenges that Ukraine has had in terms of bringing in and expanding its diplomatic presence and cultural presence in Africa. We've seen them be quite effective in the military sphere with their potential involvement in the killing of Tuareg rebels in Mali or their strikes on Hemeti's forces in Sudan. But diplomatically, their strategy has lagged a lot since the 2022 war began. Dmitry Kuleba's first African tour coincided with the Kerch bridge attack, and also with the appointment of Sergei Surovikin and the attacks on electrical infrastructure. The Ukrainians promised to create 10 new embassies in Africa. It looks like they've only built one. The South African government is just rejecting and is creating a lot of complications about potentially giving Ukraine visa-free access. So, and in general, when I engage with various African diplomats, including some of those who are at the UNGA and settings, they kind of sometimes find some of the Ukrainian rhetoric to be overly moralistic when it comes to the war with Russia, where they don't see things as so black and white. They see basically the West being bad, Russia being bad. Why should we be discouraged from engaging with Russia? So I think another key thing in terms of countering influence in Africa, my point is that Ukraine also needs to expand its diplomatic presence in Africa and its messaging and its soft power there too, because that could help serve as an antidote to how the Russian Orthodox Church might just tie the Alexandria Patriarchate with the West. I don't think that the Alexandria Patriarchate or the Greek Orthodox Church can have a strong set of counter narratives without a strong Ukrainian presence in Africa too. Those two things are related.
Okay. Next question. How can the Russian Orthodox Church outreach to Africa be successful if there's little or no Orthodox population and the goal is not to evangelize or reach out to local Orthodox populations? Would Russia's message be heard the same without church involvement?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think that basically, the Russian Orthodox Church is kind of using itself not really with theology. Theology is not so important, right? They're offering gifts and largesse, favorable information, and even though there's very few Orthodox adherents, the propaganda machine really amplifies whatever activities and ceremonies that happen. Even in places like Egypt, right, which is so overwhelmingly Islamic, small Christian community that's had a very difficult time over the past 10 years, when the Giza government basically created a Russian Orthodox Church administrative and spiritual center, and there was some Orthodox monastic visits between the Egyptians and the Russians. There was an immense amount of coverage of that in Russian backed media outlets that reach North Africa, including some of the Arabic language channels like RT Arabic and Sputnik Arabic. RT Arabic has more popularity in Egypt than Al Arabiya, and more popularity in numerous other countries in the northern half of Africa, from Sudan to Morocco, than either Al Arabiya or even Al Jazeera in some cases. And it's largely concentrated amongst young people. It's largely concentrated on YouTube and other social media websites. So the Russians have managed to promote these kind of cultural dialogues as something that's larger than life, basically way larger than the number of people that are actually converting, because of the scope and reach and efficacy of the information machinery. The same thing goes with some of the charitable gifts in that Orthodox Christian celebration I mentioned in Zimbabwe, or that documentary that the RT promoted about Christians under fire in Africa. So that's one way in which the Russian Orthodox Church manages to maintain relevance as a tool. The second thing that's useful is obviously it's better to be seen having a priest or having a religious figure promoting these sorts of ideas than a propaganda outlet or Russian diplomat or Russian official or somebody who's so inextricably linked to the Russian state. So it creates a layer of deniability about the fact that this is just personal views, not Russian state involvement, and that deniability can actually make them quite an effective messenger also. That's another point I think is worth thinking about. But in general, the narratives that we're seeing are very, very similar to what we're seeing coming from the expansion of RT. Since RT was closed and shuttered in Europe and the United States in 2022, they've invested very heavily in countries where the Russian Orthodox Church is trying to make a footprint. So one of the first bureaus that was moved was in Serbia, where they're starting to strengthen ties. Another country where they were trying to expand their reach was South Africa, where we're also seeing the entry of the Russian Orthodox Church to the Russian diaspora in some kind of a meaningful way. And some of the narratives from RT about anti-colonialism and invoking historical figures like Jomo Kenyatta or Robert Mugabe is broadly similar to what the Orthodox Church is doing about kind of promoting those same kind of people. And finally, there's a lot of synergy between the views of Pan-Africanist influencers and Russian Orthodox Church propaganda campaigns. And it's not coincidental that Kemi Seba, who's one of the Lebanese influencer, he was basically promoting the idea that the West was involved in Niger to basically capture and seize uranium rather than actually to promote counterterrorism. He was heavily involved in supporting Tchiani's coup in July of last year and in encouraging the eventual entry of Russian military instructors onto the the American drone base, right? As well as doing the same thing in Burkina Faso and in Mali. They promote common and syncretic narratives. So, but what is my overall point here? Is that Russian Orthodox Church has got the media machinery to make even small gestures look like very big ones, and that can kind of create a misleading impression of its soft power and strength to people who watch. And they also really align well with Russian state media and Pan-African influencers, and provide a view of deniability around their narratives that make them look that gives more credibility to those narratives. So that's why I think that the Russian Orthodox Church is still a potent tool, even though its religious engagement is extremely thin and it doesn't have very many adherents religiously on the continent. It doesn't need religion. Media is much more important than churches for their outreaches.
Great, thank you. You've partly answered this next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Many countries in Africa have memories of Christian religious missions as instruments of colonial expansion. Why are they sympathetic to the Russian Orthodox Church?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think also it's because of the fact that Russia basically just frames itself as as a country that's not necessarily involved in colonialism. And this narrative is obviously not new. When Patriarch Kirill took over in 2009, it also coincided with Dmitry Medvedev's first major African tour. Medvedev was an important figure in terms of strengthening Russia's relationship in Africa after the relative disengagement for the first 2 decades after the end of the Cold War. And he was that trip was important, for example, in bringing Rosatom and to Egypt with the El Daba nuclear reactor project, basically getting the early stages of that getting started, as well as promoting the alignment between the Russians and SWAPO, historically in Namibia, and basically promoting this broader idea that Russia is at the vanguard against colonialism. And the start of that anti-colonial messaging and the rise of Patriarch Kirill coincide exactly in terms of timing. That's just something that I wanted to make a note of. And that's why the Russians can promote those two narratives in synchrony with each other, because they both have been developing at the same time. Another thing is how Russian Orthodox Church uses its historical legacies and how it ties its links to the continent. When I remember I mentioned that one of the advantages the Russian Orthodox Church has is its history, right? It's the fact that it's been around for a long time. It's been active since the 19th century. That history may not necessarily be an advantage for Western churches because of their associations with, as you just noted, with civilizing missions, with racism and imperialism. But it does have some relevance for the Russians. For example, they talk about how meetings between Christians and Egyptian Christians and Copts and Russians date back to the 10th century. Some of those exchanges were basically being carried out by merchants inside Egypt in the 10th, 14th, 16th, 18th century. There were different movements. There were pilgrimages to the Near East. There were, Russian clerics and scholars getting involved in Egyptology and the discovery of culture. I mean, there's been a Russian language literature about Coptic Christianity that's been promoted quite actively that deals with this. And so my point is that the Russians have focused on other aspects of their historical legacies, like these kind of cultural exchanges, merchant exchanges, admiration for local cultures, and they have some historical narratives that they can cherry pick to back that up that contrast markedly with the Western history of using religious diplomacy as a tool of imperialism. That's why I think that they can be somewhat more effective, because they can more easily cherry pick effective things from their historical legacies, and also because this anti-colonial messaging and the rise of Patriarch Kirill coincided. So the political and the religious establishment is being meshed together. In general, I think if you like Russia or you're skeptical of the West, you'll probably gravitate towards what the Orthodox Church will say. If you're more pro-Western in your outlook or you're more liberal in your outlook, you'll probably reject both. And that's what the patriarchate is counting on.
Great. Okay. This question's a rather interesting one. Could the Orthodox outreach in Africa be more oriented on a Russian domestic audience, perhaps to downplay the fact that the Russian Orthodox Church lost Ukraine?
Well, that is definitely something that's interesting to think about. There definitely is a lot of concern in the domestic audience that the Russian Orthodox Church is losing its influence in the post-Soviet space, especially Ukraine. The inextricable linkage between Kiev and Moscow is also something that's at the church level is something that's very relevant and important. Um, yeah, so I think that that's part of what we're looking at over here. Yeah, it's about showing that Russia is not isolated religiously, just the same way that it's not isolated economically and geopolitically. So just the same way Russia uses the BRICS summit and the lack of sanctions coming from non-Western countries to promote its objective, is doing something very similar out here with the church. I tend to notice that there's very similar messaging that in general between what you see in Russian domestic media about this and what you see in terms of Russian internationally oriented media, which suggests that there is a domestic component to this too, and it's being basically the domestic outreaches and the international outreaches are on two sides of the same coin. I think that's something that's quite important to note, and yeah, because there was, for example, Kiev was actually quite important to the Russian Orthodox Church's early proselytization efforts in the Middle East and in Africa. I mean, people who study the Orthodox Church would look at somebody like Porfiry Uspensky, who was a Kievan Russian Orthodox Church theologian. He made numerous trips to the Middle East. He's one of the first Russian Egyptologists. He basically created breakthroughs after the Crimean War in the 1850s. Now those figures are kind of, on the outs because Ukraine and Russia have separated. So Russia needs to kind of create a new historical mythology about the Russian Orthodox Church's activities in Africa and the Middle East. We're seeing it in glimpses with some of those discussions about 10th century, 11th century exchanges. We haven't seen the level of historical revisionism coming out on this that we've seen on other issues like the Ukrainian statehood and the whole history of the Cold War, the post-Cold War era. That's not to say that revisionism won't happen. That revisionism hasn't happened yet, and the new version of propaganda hasn't happened yet. So the next best thing for the Russian domestic audience is basically just to cherry pick these events of how the Russian Orthodox Church is engaging effectively diplomatically, people in different countries like Russia, to show that Russia is not isolated.
Okay. Here's an interesting question, and I hope I pronounced this name correctly. The Wall Street Journal recently published an investigation showing links between Malofeev, I assume that's a Russian, and American evangelicals, all working together to push anti-gay law in Uganda. What are the relations between the American religious right and the Russian Orthodox Church in Africa?
Yeah, that is a very interesting one. Maybe Malafiev obviously is the main linkage point between the Russian state and its Orthodox Christians and the American religious right. Basically, the Malafiev's background is in investment banking and in venture capital, so that would have given him a substantial amount of access to Western countries. Marshall Capital is the investment group that was founded in 2005. It's got stakes in the telecom sector, stakes in IT. It is being used as a financial vehicle for a lot of the Russian Orthodox Church's global activities, as well as Rosatom. These are kind of the two that we should be paying attention to financially in Africa. I mentioned Rosatom more because it was not sanctioned, but this one is something that's noteworthy. Its original entry point into the Western markets was through CFG Capital in France, built primarily through European investments, but also it then branched out and started establishing ties towards the United States. And in that process, they started building connections to a variety of people. I mean, Zargrad, and which is also associated with Dugin. It's the ultra-nationalist conservative Orthodox Church outlet. Basically, it's published some of the most incendiary calls for the destruction and annihilation of Ukraine. It's often been critical of Sergei Shoigu and the Russian Defense Ministry and the Russian military performance, basically lobbying for them to have general mobilization, use nuclear weapons, fight the war more brutally, these kinds of things. They also had connections to Alex Jones and the InfoWars network and a lot of the conspiracy theorists who were later tied to QAnon. So that's one area and one spoke on the wheel. Another area, obviously, has been his hiring of conservative spin doctors and conservative influencers to before sanctions were launched. One of them was Jack Hannick. He was a former Fox employee. He helped launch Zargrad. That's another note that we should be paying attention to. He's established similar kinds of linkages with far-right lawyers and far-right politicians like Eric Zemmour, Philippe de Villiers, and some others. So this is something that he's doing a lot of. He's reaching out to the far right and the religious rights in Europe and the United States, and that's been a cornerstone of his having success, and France and the United States seem to be the key areas. So Malafiev is now a figure who is persona non grata in the West, and is one of the most extreme promoters of kind of Russian ideology. And he's now married, reportedly, to Lyubova Belova, who is the person who abducted the kids, right? And it was in the ICC. But he's had deep connections that run back a long time with the American and European right-wing movements and religious rights. And that did extend to the LGBT law in Uganda. As I noted, that Russian backlash against the Obama administration's criticisms of Uganda's gay rights policies was important for strengthening relationships between Moscow and Kampala, and that's when this cooperation would have begun ever since. An inflection point that could be quite interesting is whether a figure like Malafiev, number one, has the same degree of influence in Africa as he once had, because of his association with some of those criticisms of the war effort. He's kind of seen his influence diminish, according to some sources that I've had. We've also seen Glaziev, who was another member of this movement, who was a key economic advisor to Putin, tied into the Eurasian Commission, seemingly starting to fade politically. He may be a figure that's on the decline. And the second thing is, a lot of these Russian Orthodox Church nationalists are vehemently against the idea of diplomacy with the West or diplomacy with the United States. They see the U.S. not pushing for regime change in Georgia in 2008, not overthrowing Saakashvili as a cardinal display of weakness on Putin's part. They see the Minsk II Accords of 2015 as basically allowing the Ukrainians to buy time to rearm, and the Russians could have won the war in Ukraine if they had pushed forward in 2014, 2015, or at the very least captured places like Kharkiv and Odessa, and they can't seem to be able to capture now. So if this alliance might be strained if the American religious right and Trump start pursuing dialogue with Russia, and the Russian Orthodox Church and Malafiev and some of these influencers who have seen themselves take a knock get a bit of a resurgence and get a bit of wind out of trying to discourage Putin from entertaining these negotiations or in pursuing a negotiated settlement with the West and continuing on the path of total war. So I think that there's a good chance that the highest watermark of cooperation between these groups is in the past, but their relationships and their networks is quite fascinating, and it's quite an indictment of how some of the most anti-Western and extremist Russian figures were able to develop deep financial, media, and legal and other economic links inside Western countries for so many years before the invasion of Ukraine.
Right. Here's an interesting question, and I hope I pronounced this name correctly. Kimi Seba pushes narratives beneficial to Russia, but is he also a Russian sock puppet? Would he be effective without Russian amplification and funding?
That's a big question. I mean, obviously, he got his funding from Prigozhin. That was what the general point of view is. He's still around now, so maybe he's getting funding from somewhere else. I think the ECFR report that on Russian Orthodox Church in Africa, which I recommend people read, they talked about the Rosatom issue. That they alerted me to that. That's why I started looking that up. Russian Railways, Rusal, which is tied to Deripaska and the aluminum sector. A lot of these other organizations have been involved in funding various influencers, including in Africa. So we should be watching for where the funding is. So yeah, but I think that he is somebody who is obviously it's a kind of a marriage of convenience, right? The Russians and Prigozhin especially started realizing in 2018 and 2019 that a lot of Russian bot farms and Russian troll farms were starting to get censored by Meta. Some of them were promoting Gaddafi's regime as kind of an era of stability and prosperity in Libya. Some of them were basically promoting one was called Afrique, promoting Neuzi in Mozambique and interfering in their elections. Some others were involved in getting engaged with Madagascar and their election interference. So there were a bunch of these examples of election interference and controversies and scandals that they were involved in. And that led to the Russian state moving away from using bot farms and automated figures and towards actually hiring local influencers. One of the first influencers that they tried to use from the religious community was Pastor Milehole in Madagascar, but they tried to make him into a candidate for leadership. Ultimately, he got less than 1% of the vote. And when I was interviewing some of his former staffers, he also had a tendency or a reputation for allegedly laundering money and not paying some of his subordinates and his employees. So then they started moving towards other influencers who were anti-Western in nature and who had a bit of charisma and presence and a big voice. and one of them, who was quite prominent in West Africa, was Kemi Seba. So I think that the Russians need Kemi Seba basically to get around some of the censorship. So if it's an African voice expressing pro-Russian opinions, it becomes a freedom of speech issue rather than a state interference issue. And it also gives them more street cred and more credibility for some of the conspiracies that they're promoting about the Western theft of uranium, or the French carrying out the Gossi massacre in Mali, which was timed a fake massacre that was timed basically at the same time where the Russians carried out the Mura massacre that killed about 300 or 400 people. And Kemi Seba obviously needs Russian funding and patronage to stay relevant and to remain as a voice. So that alliance is something of an axis of convenience between the two, and it's a reflection of the Russians becoming a lot more clever in terms of evading the restrictions and the and some of the censorship of state interference activity that social media companies and Western governments are enforcing. And finally, Kemi Seba is not an isolated person. There are very, very similar people of this nature who call themselves Pan-Africanists, who are regulars on RT's coverage, especially since the July 2023 St. Petersburg Economic Forum and this new advertisement campaign where they're lionizing Kenyatta and Mugabe. These people have all been part and parcel to it, and they've been very active on the programming. Some of these people were very vocal, for example, against Bola Tinubu's stance in Nigeria, about ECOWAS military intervention in Niger. They're critical of ECOWAS. So yeah, Kemi Seba exists in a much broader information ecosystem that Russia is either funding or supporting. If you want to see the list of influencers of this nature, both of them who could be aligned with the Orthodox Church and who could be also aligned with the Pan-Africanism. So people who work for Malafiev or Dugin or Kirill or others, I strongly recommend you take a look at some of the readouts from the last May's conference on multipolarity, because that's where so many of them were. And there was one, for example, Republic of Congo government advisor who called for the expulsion of all NATO forces from Africa to big cheers. There were lots of Malian civil society figures that have links to these people. That's an interesting gathering to pay attention to, because that's where you'll be seeing a lot of these people. There was also more recently a conference of Russophiles that brought together people as eclectic as African influencers, Zhang Weiwei, Xi Jinping strategist, American far-right conspiracy theorists like Jackson Hinkle and many others in a similar way. So these conferences on multipolarity, conferences of Russophiles, these are places to watch if you want to see how this ecosystem is developing and changing, because that gives you a clue as to who might be on Russia's payroll and to who Russia might be using as surrogates to promote their agenda in Africa and globally.
Well, thank you. And as usual, we've come to the end of our time without coming to the end of our questions from the audience. I apologize to those in the audience whose questions we didn't get to. And I thank you, Dr. Ramani, very much for your most enlightening presentation. This event has been recorded and will be posted soon, within 24 to 48 hours, on YouTube on the FPRI site. I encourage you to share it with your networks. Those of you who came in late can see the introduction in the recording. And again, remind you that we look forward to seeing you at future FPRI events on Africa. Again, thank you, Dr. Ramani, for being here. Thank you all for joining us, and have a nice weekend and a nice day.